Our first reading is from the Eulogy of James J. Reeb by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. One day, the history of this great period of social change will be written in all of its completeness. On that bright day, our nation will recognize its real heroes. They will be thousands of dedicated men and women with a noble sense of purpose that enables them to face fury and hostile mobs with the agonizing loneliness that characterizes the life of the pioneers. They will be faceless, anonymous, relentless young people, black and white, who have temporarily left behind the towers of Negro women, symbolized in a 72-year-old Negro woman in Montgomery, Alabama, who rose up with a sense of dignity and with the people decided not to ride the segregated buses, who responded with ungrammatical profundity to one who inquired about her weariness. My feet is tired, but my soul is rested. They will be ministers of the gospel, priests, rabbis, nuns, who are willing to march for freedom, to go to jail for conscience sake. One day, the South will know these dedicated children of God, courageously protesting segregation. They were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream, standing up with the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage, thereby carrying our whole nation back to those great wells of democracy, which were dug deep by the Founding Fathers in the formulation of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. When this glorious story is written, the name of James Reeb will stand as a shining example of manhood at its best.
Our second reading is by Dorothy Day from her collection of selected writings. What we would like to do is change the world, make it a little simpler for people to feed, clothe, and shelter themselves as God intended them to do. And by fighting for better conditions, by crying out unceasingly for the rights of the workers, the poor, of the destitute, the rights of the worthy and unworthy poor. In other words, we can, to a certain extent, change the world. We can work for the oasis, the little cell of joy and peace in a harried world. We can throw our pebble in the pond and be confident that its ever-widening circle will reach around the world. We repeat, there is nothing we can do but love. And, dear God, please enlarge our hearts to love each other, to love our neighbor, to love our enemy as our friend.
I first shared the following experience 7 years ago as a personal reflection at a service at East Shore. When in my early 20s, I was dating a young woman, Mary Lee by name, who was a newly minted social worker. Mary Lee had some interesting connections, including friendships with some of the local Black Panthers. In fact, due to this, Mary Lee found out she was on some kind of subversives list kept by the local police departments, and I think even the FBI. Her phone had been tapped, and so she had it removed. Mary Lee was deeply committed to helping others. She liked crossing barriers to engage folks who might be vastly different from people like us, who came from white middle-class backgrounds. And in general, she liked to engage many people of many varying opinions and ideologies. As a young social worker, one of Mary Lee's undertakings was to have some of the children of her clients spend the weekend with her, during which time she would take them to museums, concerts, nice restaurants, and other events that they might not ordinarily be able to enjoy. This was on a one-at-a-time basis. You have to bear in mind, this was all happening in Cleveland in the years just following the Huff riots. There was a lot of racial tension and a lot of fear, and I was afraid myself. There were certain things you just wouldn't do. For example, as a white person, you wouldn't drive into the Huff area for fear you might be harmed or killed. At least that describes the fear I had, even though I didn't hate Black people and was raised not to hate people of other colors or races. But I did have the fear nonetheless. I think I understood that Black people have good reasons to hate white people. One day, Mary Lee contacted me and told me that she had promised to take a young 8-year-old boy for a weekend, but for some reason, I can't recall, she couldn't keep this commitment. She was terribly embarrassed that she had to break her promise and asked if I would go with her and explain to the mother of the boy in person that she could not keep her commitment that weekend, but that she would make it up another time. The plan was to drive into Huff together and for me to walk up to the house, knock on the door, and speak to the mother. Yikes. Drive into Huff and approach the door of someone's home? This sounded and felt risky, but I agreed to do it, and so off we went. As expected, the homes in Huff looked run down and badly in need of repair. I left Mary Lee's car with much trepidation, walked up the steps to the boy's home, which was part of a 2-story quadplex. I braced myself. Would I encounter hostility, perhaps even anger or worse? The door opened almost right away. I remember the face of the woman who answered, who was the boy's mother. She was calm, quiet, tranquil. I explained Mary Lee's situation. The woman remained calm, quiet, and tranquil. She responded with something like, "That's okay, I understand." Phew, I was relieved. I had survived the encounter, but I was blown away by that woman's kindness, courtesy, and dignity. I had met this other and found her not only to be like me, but, I thought, better than me. I got back to the car and Mary Lee asked, "How did it go?" And I replied, "Great, she completely understands. It's okay." I think Mary Lee could clearly see my relief, and she replied, "Well now, you're a brother." Since I first shared this personal reflection 7 years ago, my perspective on race has evolved. I think a lot of it is the realization that things aren't going to get better simply by each of us being nice to each other. Racism is so ingrained in our society and its systems, and in each of us. It's a life's work to overcome it, or to try to overcome it, both for individuals and for our society.
Maybe you've noticed, I'm committed to making my sermons accessible to everyone, regardless of their level of education or their vocabulary. Primarily, that means using language that doesn't require a dictionary to understand, avoiding what my mother calls 50-cent words or specialized jargon. So I want to start this morning's sermon by defining the word soteriology. Technically, it means a doctrine of salvation. In a Christian context, that could mean understanding how a person gets into heaven. But in a more general sense, a more secular sense, it means studying what it is that saves us, what it is that saves any of us or all of us from anything that puts us in danger. Soteriology can be expressed by an individual, a creed, or by a nation's policies and procedures. Reclaiming Prophetic Witness, Liberal Religion in the Public Square is a book by Unitarian Universalist theologian Paul Reiser. I've quoted from it a few times over the years since it was our UUA common read. In that book, Reiser explains the soteriology of the United States, our understanding of what will keep us safe from danger. And he explains it through the lens of Walter Wink. Like religious mythologies everywhere, its story is ritualistically told and retold so that its explanatory power is continually reinforced. The basic storyline is always the same. Think of any Western movie or any modern equivalent, such as Star Wars, any police or detective story, any superhero story. In every case, bad violence, symbolizing the evil we must conquer, is overcome by good violence. The good guys bring the bad guys to justice by applying superior force and sometimes superior intelligence, either by capturing or killing them. This mythological narrative is repeated in children's cartoons and video games, many of which are cast in explicitly militaristic terms. Our children learn the salvific power of force and violence at an early age. This deeply ingrained worldview seems perfectly normal. Violence is so successful as a myth precisely because it does not seem to be mythic in the least, Wink declares. Violence simply appears to be the nature of things. Reiser goes on to say that as a country, we tend to look and behave like schoolyard bullies when we don't get our way. And especially over the last 5 years or so, that's how we're perceived around the world, as imperialists who use force to get our way. This attitude that the world is a violent place whose problems are only solved through violence is so endemic that even the most peaceable among us in our daily relationships, we expect to win arguments by dominating the conversation. We tend to think that a barrage of facts and figures can win an argument through shock and awe. To silence our detractors is to win the fight. Philosopher and social commentator Cornel West describes the American democratic system as being sustained by a tragicomic commitment to hope. For West, this is not simply about being optimistic, but involves a deeper form of spirituality, the ability to persevere, to continue the struggle for justice even when all seems hopeless. He describes this kind of hope as the ability to laugh and retain a sense of joy, to preserve hope even while staring in the face of hate and hypocrisy, as against falling into the nihilism of paralyzing despair. Sharon Welch, a Unitarian Universalist theologian who teaches at Meadville Lombard in Chicago, has been studying the intersection of liberal religion and social activism for decades. In her estimation, our desire for control can lead to frustration and resignation. We want to respond to injustice, but in our own way and on our own terms. Welch suggests that this need for control leads to discouragement when things don't go as planned. The result is that religious liberals often have trouble sustaining their motivation to work for change over the long term. Basically, what Razor is saying, using West and Welch to back him up, is that as Americans, we measure the success of our beliefs by ability to win arguments with our detractors. Let me say that again. We measure the success of our beliefs by our ability to win arguments with our detractors. If we lose, we tend to keep trying the same tactics, convinced that all it will take is persistence, even after all seems hopeless. We are saved by our sheer unwillingness to give up. Until we do give up. By then, it's become undeniably clear that we'll never win the argument, so we just move on to another issue. And if you do this enough times, it will change you. The culture remains the same, deeply entrenched in arguing extreme views on issues. But you're changed. You close yourself off. You get sick of the fight. You stop listening. I'm reminded of Jason Shelton's hymn, based on a speech given by then president of the UUA, Bill Sinkford. Sometimes we build a barrier to keep love tightly bound, corrupted by fear, unwilling to hear, denying the beauty we found. Though it may have become apparent to Hafiz way back in the 14th century that listening to others deeply is vital to human development, and though we may be reminded of that fact daily, and we have proof that it is true that we only learn by listening to those we agree with, my feeling is that Bill Sinkford was right. My feeling is that in order to avoid the discomfort of conflict and the disappointment that comes with not winning the fight, we tend to shut down. We tend to stop listening. We stop learning. We stop growing, despite our best intentions. As much as we may want to make it a little simpler for people to feed, clothe, and shelter themselves, as Dorothy Day said, we're sometimes not really convinced that our little pebbles will make any ripples in even the smallest ponds. We make for ourselves little oases of joy and peace in a harried world. When I first delivered this sermon, we were about to celebrate the birthday of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the 50th anniversary of the March on Selma, when James Reeb lost his life. King had a grand vision for what could happen if priests, rabbis, nuns, willing to march for freedom, would go to jail for conscience sake. He really believed that we could stand up for the best in the American dream, thereby carrying our whole nation back to those great wills of democracy. He really believed that white religious liberals, like Reeb, a Unitarian minister, would stand as shining examples of what could happen if white people persisted in arguing for racial equality. But for decades now, we white allies would like to see harmony in a nation that we know remains very different for people of different skin tones. As more of us become aware of why it's important to uphold that Black Lives Matter, we want to do something to make it possible. But many of us have become disillusioned, especially as we watch one shooting after another of unarmed Black people by police, and the violence that erupts from the protests that follow. Many of us are losing motivation. For religious liberals, this loss of motivation is a common experience, regardless of how we see race. We continue to try to convince each other as we disagree about the economy, the environment, immigration, tribalism in politics, education, domestic terrorism, you name it. And the more we talk, the less things change. and the less we feel heard, and the more disillusioned we get. A few years ago, Keith Cron, the transition director at the UUA, gave me a model for communicating that I found astonishing in its simplicity and its effectiveness. He didn't claim to have created it and didn't have a name for it, but he shared the model with congregations, considering a minister who was not able-bodied, middle-class, heteronormative, white, and male. I've come to think of it as spheres of influence. I guess we could even think of it as ripples in a pond. Imagine an issue that you feel strongly about. Any issue, something that affects you so profoundly, something so core to who you are, that your feelings about it are absolute and pure. Nobody will ever change your mind to the contrary. Maybe it's a belief that all women should have reproductive freedom no matter what, or that war is always wrong, period, or that capital punishment is the only true justice in some cases. You probably feel so strongly about this issue because you've experienced it firsthand. That makes you a 1. You're smack in the center of the circle. Now the next sphere, sphere 2, is occupied by people who agree with you. They may not have the same experience you have, so they're not as committed. They speak less passionately about the subject, but understand where you're coming from and agree. They are your best allies, the people who could share your experience without looking self-serving in the process. The next sphere, sphere 3, is where the middle of the road folks live. They're the ones who haven't given the subject much thought and, if approached by a 2, could speak dispassionately. 3s might become an ally. They might become a 2. Or conversely, if approached by you or another passionate 1, could be totally turned away. They could literally be so turned off by what they're hearing as self-serving that they move in the other direction. In that case, they would become a 4. They would be so far removed from the subject and have such a negative understanding of it that they would be actively against you. They'd say, I tried talking to those people, but they're so angry, so convinced they're right, they can't hear a word the rest of the world is saying. They think we're stupid. So basically, 1s can never really communicate effectively with 3s or 4s. Let me give a real-world example. Any person who wants to marry another person of the same sex is a 1 in the culture war that is labeled marriage equality. In this case, I am a 1. A person at the other extreme, a 4, will call himself a defender of traditional marriage. A middle-of-the-road person, a 3, will be unsure. Now, if I approach that 3 and use words like homophobic to describe a 4, a person that could be her husband or her teacher or her minister, guess what? She's likely to be so offended, so struck by the fallacy of the statement, that she'll never agree with me. She didn't really have an opinion before we talked, but my passionate expression of my feelings of exclusion and oppression from the norm that she lives in may be exactly the thing that convinces her that I'm wrong. She's likely to say something like, I tried talking to him, but he's got it all wrong. My husband doesn't hate him. My husband only wants to preserve our marriage. Now, if that middle-of-the-road 3 were approached by one of my dispassionate allies, a 2, maybe a person I used to work with who never knew that he knew any LGBT people before me, the outcome could be entirely different. This 2 could say to the 3, Denis is just a regular guy. He doesn't want to take away my marriage. He only wants to make sure that if he or his husband were to die, the other would have all of the legal rights that my wife and I enjoy. It only seems fair. And how would a two come to understand how Joe and I feel? Well, they'd ask. And the thing is, when people ask a question, they really listen to the answer, and real communication can happen. They can absorb the stories and turn around and share them again. Now, nothing is to say that a single two could change the mind of a three. But if a three hears enough twos, enough times, that's when things begin to change. That's when a three can become a two. If you're a one, the best threes, the ones that are most likely to change into twos, are the ones who make a practice of going into things with an open mind, especially when they don't know anything about the subject. But openness only goes so far. A little too much zeal can push them away easily. So ones can only really talk to twos, but twos can talk to both ones and threes. There's enough common language to be able to understand each other. The fours, if you're a one, you'll never change their minds, just like they'll never change your mind. In those moments when you're a one and you find yourself with a four, just change the subject to something you can agree on, even if it's just the weather. Ever since Keith taught me this model, I've changed. When I'm a one, I only talk to twos on that topic, and I save myself and everyone else a lot of aggravation. When I'm a three, I try to really live into that space. I leave myself open to learning more and being changed, rather than staking a claim in the territory of one or four. Philosophical purity, frankly, doesn't mean that much to me. Mostly, though, I try to find all those places where I'm a two, or could become a two. That's where I know I can create the most change and possibly help someone who is suffering. I'm a two on topics like animal rights, domestic violence, gun control. Those are subjects that affect me and affect all of us, about which I can speak dispassionately as one who's not directly affected. I'm not a four-footed domesticated animal. I have never experienced domestic violence, and I neither own guns nor do I want to outlaw them. Think about all the issues that face our world today, where the polar opposites dominate the public discourse with mutual mistrust. Black Lives Matter, police accountability, the right to peaceful protest, the last election, the January 6th attack on the Capitol, rising violence against Americans of Southeast Asian descent, the pandemic, the science behind getting it under control, wearing masks and getting vaccinations. Those are just a few. But in that litany of issues, where are you a one? Which issues affect you so deeply and personally that you can only talk about them with deep passion? Possibly to the point of feeling discouraged that anything will ever change. And which issues can you have a little more distance from? Which issues can you speak effectively to an uninvolved three? If you're a one, save your energy. Talk to twos. And if you're a two, know that that's your superpower in the issue. My hope for us in these times of tumult and change is that we'll find the places where we can be twos, the places where we can be effective allies to those in the center of any controversy, not invested in winning the argument, but rather invested in listening. We'll find the issues about which we can speak with measured confidence and authority to the threes, while learning more about the subject from the ones. Those are the places where we can be bridges, mediators, peacemakers. That's how we can create change. That's how we can stay motivated and keep from feeling burnt out. Focusing on conversations that could be productive instead of beating a dead horse in a battle that we can't possibly win. Maybe knowing where we fit in the concentric spheres of influence is all we need to stay connected with each other and to have a real impact on the world. And maybe even do that work together. Maybe bringing our twos out will help keep us from burning ourselves out and actually making change. May it be so. The reading we heard this morning by the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was never reprinted, not once, in the first 36 years after it was delivered. It's kind of astounding, considering how often some of his utterances have been repeated. Things like his letter from the Birmingham jail, his "I Have a Dream" speech, the speech in which he said the arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice, borrowing the words of Unitarian Theodore Parker. Or the last time he spoke publicly, eerily foretelling his own murder. There's one thing, though, that I've never heard repeated from him: an offering. Maybe he never had to stand in front of people and ask for money. If he didn't, it's kind of a shame, because he would have been denied the opportunity to ask good and generous people to share their bounty with organizations that seek to create more justice and compassion in the world. So I'll ask you, as not even the Reverend King himself seems to have done, to give to support the work of the church. Send in a check to fulfill your pledge from last year. And make sure you've returned your pledge card for this year. And if you're new to eShore, please consider supporting us financially. Any amount makes a difference and shows you care about what we're trying to accomplish together. Thank you for being here. And thank you for your support. This morning's benediction is by Paul Sawyer. May we have the ears to hear the prophets of our own time. May we have the wisdom to discern their message through the noise and discord of our lives. May we have the strength to do what must be done in this world. May we find the courage to live our lives as lives of conviction, of spirit, of faith. May we know justice and peace in our time. May it be so. Please join me and my husband, Reverend Joe, in reciting our bond of union. The words are printed at the bottom of the screen. We join hands in Unitarian Universalist fellowship, pledging ourselves to an individual religious freedom which transcends all creeds, not to think alike, but to journey together.